Anthony Hopkins stepped through the doors of the concert hall, breathing in the cool Los Angeles night air. The evening city was alive with its own life. Taxis darted between the lanes, cafe signs cast a warm glow on the sidewalks, and the few passers-by hurried home. For most, this moment was just another evening. For him, it was a silence in which he could hear himself think. He performed in a closed hall for a narrow circle of connoisseurs, playing on the piano the old melodies that once saved him from madness. But now, leaving the stage, he felt reality enveloping him again, like a too-tight jacket. He was walking toward his car, parked at the curb, when he noticed movement at the bus stop across the street. A woman, young, maybe 30, with a baby in her arms. She wasn't begging, or holding out her hand, or looking around for sympathy. She was simply sitting on a bench, clutching the baby tightly to her, as if he were the last thread holding her to this world. Anthony slowed his pace. Something icy blew from the bus stop. Not wind, but emotion. Fear, despair, silent surrender to life. He had seen them before. When he was a boy in Wales, wandering the streets of a small provincial town, peering into dark windows. There, behind the glass, lived shadows. People who had lost something important, broken. They no longer had hope. Just like this woman. The baby in her arms moved slightly, and then he noticed the details. The too thin blanket she was trying to cover the baby with, the cheap sneakers on her feet, the torn jacket that barely hid her thinness. But what struck him most were the eyes. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, and in that second he saw emptiness. Not anger, not a request, not hope. Only a boundless, all-consuming emptiness. Anthony stopped. It only lasted for a moment, but something inside him froze. He knew he should just walk past. Just get in the car and drive away. But he couldn't. For what? Part of his mind immediately began to construct logical explanations. Perhaps she was waiting for her husband or a friend who would soon take her away. Perhaps she was simply tired. But some deeper part of his being already knew the truth. Nobody will come, and she knew it too. At that moment, a man approached the bus stop, short, in a dirty jacket, with a bottle of beer in his hand. He stopped next to the woman, cast a hunted glance at her, and grinned. "Hey, honey, is it cold?" His voice was laced with cheap alcohol. She didn't answer. She just hugged the child tighter. "I can warm you up." He took a step closer. Anthony didn't hesitate. He crossed the road, striding steadily toward the bus stop. The man noticed him approaching, paused for a second, and then spat on the pavement. "What do you want, old man?" Anthony didn't answer. He just looked at him, coldly, dispassionately, into his eyes. The man hesitated for a second, then muttered something, and shaking his head, turned and disappeared into the alley. The woman didn't even move. Anthony looked at her, not knowing what to say. "Do you need help?" he finally asked. She remained silent. The sound of an approaching bus could be heard in the distance. The woman stood up abruptly, holding the child, and took a step forward, as if she was going to sit in him. Anthony felt that if she sat down, he would never see her again, and that would be a mistake. He took a step forward, blocking her path. "Please wait." She looked up at him, and she said just 2 words. "Late." At that moment, a bus pulled up. The doors opened. Anthony could only watch as she took a step forward. And at the last second, already stepping onto the running board, she slowly turns her head towards him and almost silently says, "Thank you." The doors closed. The bus left. Anthony was left standing alone. Anthony stood still, watching the bus disappear into the stream of city lights at night. She left. Those 2 words tore at his consciousness. What had he just done? Or rather, what had he not done? He could have stopped her. He could have said something important. He could have offered some kind of help. But all he did was let her get on that damn bus. The cool air no longer seemed refreshing. It had become heavy, suffocating. Anthony mechanically ran his hand over his face and closed his eyes. Damn. One look from this woman burned a hole in him. A look that had everything. Weariness, pain, resignation. He had seen this look before. He knew this look. How many years have passed? 10? 20? An eternity? He is 8 years old. London. A chilly evening. The same icy air. The same endless darkness. He stands at the dirty window of their tiny flat, his forehead pressed against the glass, listening to his mother screaming at his father again in the next room. She is sending him away again. "You are a worthless person. Your lies will destroy us all." "Shut up, Muriel." Crash. Broken dishes. Anthony doesn't cry. He hasn't cried in a long time. He just stares out the window looking at the distant streetlights. Maybe if he stares long enough, this city will finally spit them out. He didn't know then that these would be his last memories of his parents together. Father left that night. He never saw him again. Years later, he learned that his father had died on the street, frozen to death somewhere outside London, without a home, without a job, without a family. That night, his mother left too, not physically, but something inside her broke. She never held him like that again. She never sang to him before bed. Her heart turned to stone. And now, so many years later, in the eyes of this stranger, he saw the same doom that had once frozen in the eyes of his mother. God, how could he just let her go? The brain began to work faster. Where could she get out? What was she going to do? She didn't even have any luggage, just the baby and a cheap blanket. Anthony turned abruptly and headed towards his car. Damn. The engine roared and he pulled out onto the road. It was madness. Looking for a stranger in the city at night? Absurd. But he knew he wouldn't sleep unless he tried. He drove slowly, his eyes sliding along the sidewalks. People were clustered near bars. Some were hurrying to the subway. Some were just wandering aimlessly. But she was nowhere to be found. He picked up speed. If she got off at the next stop, then she's somewhere around here. But where? And then he saw her. She stood in a narrow alley, leaning against the wall, her eyes closed. The child slept peacefully in her arms, and next to her stood a man, short, in a tattered leather jacket, with his hands in his pockets. And he spoke to her. Anthony braked but did not turn off the engine. The man spoke, and she just nodded. She didn't look scared. More like exhausted. Anthony had seen it before. People pushed to the brink sometimes accepted offers they would regret for the rest of their lives. He opened the car door. Emily, the man said, come on, don't be silly. I'm not offering anything complicated. Just a night. You want money? I want company. Anthony froze. No. The woman did not answer. She just looked away. Not at the man, not at the ground, but at Anthony. She saw him. He took a step forward. I would advise you to retreat. The man shuddered and turned around abruptly. Who are you, old man? Anthony didn't react. He only looked at her. Come with me, he said quietly. She blinked as if she couldn't believe her ears. What? I'm not asking. Let's just go. The man looked at Anthony and laughed. Are you kidding me? You think you can just take her away? Anthony did not answer. He looked only at her, and she took a step towards him. The man immediately grabbed her hand. Wait a minute, baby. The child in her arms twitched and stirred, and the next moment Anthony struck. Fast, precise, without warning, right in the solar plexus. The man doubled over, exhaling air with a whistle, and fell to his knees. Anthony didn't give him a chance to come to his senses. He took her by the wrist and, without saying a word, led her to the car. She didn't resist. She just walked. The child in her arms became quiet again. Anthony opened the door for her. She sat down. He got behind the wheel without saying a word. It was only when they started moving that he heard her voice. Who are you? He looked ahead at the road. A man who couldn't just leave. She turned away to the window. It was quiet in the cabin. It was only after a few seconds that he heard her whisper. Thank you. Anthony gripped the steering wheel tighter. This night is not over yet. Tell me where we are going? The woman's voice sounded even, but tense. Anthony was silent, looking at the road. He didn't know what to answer. He just drove. Here in Los Angeles, there were plenty of people living on the edge. Those who clung to the last vestiges of human dignity, and those who had long since lost it. But she was still holding on, although I was on the last edge. The baby in her arms began to move, and she began to rock him automatically without even looking. The movement was honed to the point of instinct, as if her own body no longer belonged to her, only to him, the baby, who did not know that his mother was standing a step away from the abyss. Anthony felt anger rising within him. Why was she here? Why was this allowed? I don't know, he finally answered, but I certainly won't leave you on the street. She remained silent. The road wound between dark neighborhoods. You don't even know who I am, but I know what's wrong with you. She smiled weakly, but it was not amusement. And what about me? Anthony gripped the steering wheel. You are a person who does not give up, even when everything says it's time. She looked at him. It sounds like a death sentence. He nodded. This is true. The car stopped at a traffic light. Anthony leaned forward, placing his hand on the gearbox, but was in no hurry to move. What happened? He asked. She was silent for a long time. Then she exhaled. It's a long story. I'm in no hurry. She chuckled again. I used to think so too. Silence. My name is Emily. Anthony nodded. I know. She turned her head in surprise. Where? He shrugged. That man in the alley called you that. Emily turned back to the window. It doesn't matter. The traffic light changed to green, but he didn't move. Do you want me to take you to a specific place? She thought about it. What if I say no? So you have nowhere to go now? She pressed her lips together. I have nowhere to go. Anthony nodded silently and stepped on the gas again. She didn't ask where he was taking her. Maybe she didn't care. Or maybe she's just tired of being afraid. The hotel was small but cozy. As they entered the lobby, the night manager, a plump Latino with a friendly face, looked up from his computer and smiled welcomingly. Good evening, Mr. Hopkins. Emily winced. She turned her head sharply towards Anthony. Mr. Hopkins. His name came from her lips with the same intonation with which a man drowning in the ocean would pronounce the name of a ship sailing past. She recognized him. Of course. Anthony didn't answer. He simply pulled out his credit card and handed it to the receptionist. One room. Quiet. The administrator nodded, scanned the payment, and handed him the key card. Room 214. On the second floor, overlooking the park. Anthony took the card and turned to Emily. Let's go. She didn't move. She didn't finish the sentence. She tried to comprehend. Millions of people knew his face, his voice, his manner of speaking. But she doesn't, because there was no cinema in her world. In her world, there was survival. She swallowed. Why? He didn't pretend not to understand. Because I can. She shook her head. I can't accept this. He looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient who refuses a life-saving operation. Then accept this not for yourself. She looked down at the child, and she said nothing. I just took the key card. The room was small but clean. Emily walked slowly inside, clutching her son in her arms, looking around as if she was afraid that if she touched something, it would disappear. Anthony remained standing at the door. She walked over to the bed and carefully laid the child down, covering him with a light blanket. The child didn't even wake up. He is tired. You too. She didn't answer. She stood for a while, then sank to the floor, leaning her back against the bed. Anthony realized that she was afraid to sit on the bed, as if it were some kind of luxury that was inaccessible to her. Are you just going to sit there? She looked up at him. And you? I'll leave. She nodded. Thank you. Anthony stepped towards the exit, but before he closed the door behind him, he heard her voice. I don't remember the last time I slept in a bed. He froze, turned around. She looked at him. He looked at. There were no tears in her eyes. Only emptiness. He didn't say anything. Just closed the door. Went downstairs, and he got into the car. But he didn't leave. He remained waiting. Anthony sat in the car, watching the second-floor windows. The light in room 214 was on. He knew he couldn't just leave. Something in him wouldn't let him leave it like this. Maybe it was his conscience. Maybe it was the damn memory of the past. But deep down, he knew that if he turned around and left now, he would never forgive himself. The hours dragged on slowly. The light in the room was still on. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the headrest, letting the memories wash over him like a cold wave. Mr. Hopkins, your father died of hypothermia. Where? On the street, in the suburbs of London. Was he alone? Yes. Anthony was silent for a long time, and then he asked, Why didn't anyone help? The sharp sound of the telephone brought him back to reality. He picked up the phone. Yes? Mr. Hopkins, sorry to disturb you. It was that same night manager. What's happened? The lady you checked in, she went downstairs with a child. She's been standing by the exit for about 10 minutes now. Anthony opened his eyes. I see. Thank you. He got out of the car and crossed the parking lot. Emily stood at the glass doors of the hotel. The child slept peacefully in her arms. When she saw him, her face did not change. You didn't leave? No. She looked at him for a long time. Why? I couldn't. She nodded as if it was the only logical answer. I can't accept this. Why? She ran her tongue over her dry lips. I've been alone for too long. I'm not used to help. Anthony stepped closer. Suck an eye. You'll have to get used to it, because you shouldn't live like this. She looked away. It's not that simple. I know. Emily took a deep breath, hugging the baby close. I'm used to people passing by. I didn't pass. She looked at him as if trying to figure out if he was really serious. Sockening. What if I disappoint you? Anthony smiled slightly. I don't get disappointed in people. Only in myself. She suddenly laughed nervously. You speak like someone who has never made a single mistake in life. Anthony sighed. I have more of them than I can count. She fell silent. Then she looked at him again. What should I do? The question sounded like a confession, as the first real admission that she needed help. Anthony thought about it. I found temporary housing for you. It's simple, but safe. There are people there who will help with documents, with work. Emily squeezed the baby tighter. If I agree, will it make me weak? No, it will make you strong. She nodded silently. Then she looked at the road, and she stepped forward. Fine. Anthony opened the car door for her. She sat down. When he got behind the wheel, she suddenly said quietly, Thank you. He didn't answer. I just hit the gas. This night is not over yet. Anthony watched her standing outside the hotel, holding the baby as if she was afraid he would disappear if she loosened her grip. He had seen women broken by life, but not like Emily. There was no emptiness in her eyes like so many who had given up long ago. No, there was something else there. Anger. Anger at myself for allowing me to be here. That which accepts help, that he doesn't know how to refuse it. Anthony didn't move, just waited. She turned away to the glass doors, staring out into the darkness of the street. I have to leave. Why? She shook her head without looking at him. Because if I stay, I'll have to admit that I can't cope anymore. He frowned. You don't have to cope alone. But it's always been like this. Her voice broke. She spun around, her eyes flashing with rage, but a moment later, she had regained control. The baby stirred slightly in its sleep, and instinctively she began to rock it. You don't understand. I'm used to being alone. Anthony nodded slowly. I understand. She gave a nervous laugh. You can't understand. She paused and looked at him closely. Do you know what it's like? To be on the sidelines of life? Anthony clenched his jaw. His voice was quiet. I know. Emily froze for a moment, then looked down. I can't accept this. Shanono. You can't? Or are you afraid? She raised her head sharply, meeting his gaze. Anthony took a step closer. You shouldn't live like this. But I'm alive, she answered defiantly, as if trying to provoke him. But there was too much pain in her voice. You don't have to. She lowered her head as if trying to digest his words. I don't know how else. Anthony didn't look away. Let me help. Emily shook her head. What if I fail? What if I take help and then end up on the street anyway? He answered without hesitation. Then I'll help again. She exhaled convulsively, as if these words were too much for her. I'm not used to trusting. Try it. Emily looked at him for a long time, and then she said just one word. Okay. She stepped toward the car. Anthony opened the door for her. She sat down. When he got behind the wheel, she suddenly said quietly, Thank you. He didn't answer. I just hit the gas. This night is not over yet. The car glided through the empty streets of Los Angeles, taking them away from a life in which there was no place, no future. Anthony was silent, his eyes focused on the road, but he could feel the tension radiating from Emily. She sat in the passenger seat, clutching the baby to her like the last piece of a broken world. Where are we going? Her voice was even, but there was an icy edge to it. Anthony nodded to the side. Dari, there is a place, temporary housing. They will help there. She pressed her lips together. A charity shelter? No, it's a private center. There are people there who know how to lift people like you off their knees. They don't look down on you. She turned away to the window. It's still alms. Anthony's grip on the steering wheel tightened. If you are walking across a bridge and you see a person hanging on the railing, holding one hand, and you extend the other to him, is that alms? She didn't answer. Anthony turned his head towards her. Adoreum. You are not lazy. You are not weak-willed. You are not stupid. You are just stuck in a system where one wrong step can cost you everything. She continued to look out the window. What if I can't? You already did it. You accepted help. Emily slowly closed her eyes. Ano. I don't want to be someone's problem. Anthony frowned. You are not a problem. You are a human being. These words hit her so hard that she almost gasped. She's been hearing for so long that she's a problem, a burden, a mistake, and now someone said otherwise. She suddenly laughed, briefly and bitterly. It's strange. I thought that if I died, no one would notice. Anthony slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed. She jerked, clutching the child. What the hell? Anthony turned to face her. His voice was icy. Never say that. Emily's eyes widened. He exhaled slowly, loosening his grip on the steering wheel. I won't let you think that your life is worthless. She swallowed. For the first time all night, fear appeared in her eyes, but not in front of him, in front of myself. She looked at the child sleeping in her arms and her breathing became ragged. I'm just tired. Anthony nodded. That's why I'm here. She looked at him again. For what? Anthony looked into her eyes and said quietly, because once I also thought that if I disappeared, no one would care. And someone proved me wrong. Emily swallowed hard. And what happened? Anthony turned on his turn signal and pulled back onto the road. I stayed, and now I stand here, with you. She remained silent. The car was moving through the night city. It was only after a few minutes that Emily quietly said, I'm afraid. Anthony did not turn his head. That's good. Fear is a sign that you're still fighting. Emily closed her eyes, hugging the baby tighter. She didn't answer, but something inside her had already changed. This night is not over yet. The car glided smoothly through the night streets of Los Angeles, filling the cabin with the quiet purr of the engine. Anthony drove slowly, not even because the roads were empty, but because he felt that any sudden maneuver could destroy the fragile balance of this night. Emily sat nearby, looking out the window. The light from the street lamps reflected in her eyes, making them deeper, darker. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just occasionally hugged the baby tighter, as if it was the only thing keeping her in this world. The minutes dragged on until she suddenly spoke. Are you rich? Anthony turned his head, a slight smile touching his lips. Why do you ask? Because you have money to help me. That means you are rich, he nodded. Yes, she looked at him. Then you don't understand. Anthony didn't look away. I understand more than you think. Emily smiled bitterly. Have you ever slept in a car in the winter? Woke up because your fingers were so cold you couldn't bend them? No. Have you ever walked into a store knowing you had $7 in your pocket and your child needed to eat, but ended up buying a pack of crackers and a bottle of water because you didn't have enough for anything else? No. She pressed her lips together. Then you don't understand. Anthony turned the wheel, turning onto a quieter street. I don't know what it's like to live in a car, but I know what it's like to be afraid of the next day. Emily didn't answer. I know what it's like to lose everything you believe in, to be left without a purpose, without people, without meaning. I know what it's like to wake up and see no reason to get out of bed. She exhaled sharply. But you got up. Anthony looked at her. Yes, because someone helped me. Emily shook her head, her eyes filling with anger. Sharna, but you had someone to call for help. But I didn't. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Anthony gripped the steering wheel. Now there is. Emily gritted her teeth. What if I say that I don't want to? That I don't believe you? That all this is just a way for a rich man to ease his conscience? Anthony nodded. Then I'll leave. She winced. What? If you say you want to leave, I will leave. I am not forcing you. She looked down. I don't know. What? How to live if things suddenly become easier. Anthony froze. She closed her eyes. I'm used to fighting. Every day, every minute. If the fight suddenly ends, what will be left? He remained silent, and then he said, Life. Emily slowly unclenched her fingers. I don't know if I can live in it. Anthony looked at her and said quietly, I'll teach you. She raised her head, fear frozen in her eyes, fear of hope. The car turned towards a small building with soft light in the windows. Anthony stopped. Let's go. Emily didn't move. I can't. You can. I'm afraid. This is fine. She looked at the door behind which was another life. Her lips trembled. If I go there, it means I admit that I lost. Anthony shook his head. No, it means you won. Emily pressed her lips together, and she stepped toward the door. As they entered the center, the silence was overwhelming. There was no big city noise, no cars, no one in a hurry. Everything was neat, calm, as if this corner of the world was just waiting to be noticed. As if everything that happened in this building was important, but quietly, reservedly, without unnecessary words. Emily stood at the door, her eyes darting around the room as if she were searching for a possible exit, a place where she wouldn't have to ask for help. But Anthony knew she wouldn't leave. Her resolve was not yet broken. But this center, this new, strange world, was the first step toward feeling human again. What now? Her voice was quiet, but there was a new alarm in it. Just follow me. He led her to the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman sat. The woman looked at them, and immediately realizing that they had not come for simple shelter, but for something more important, smiled. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Emily looked at Anthony, who nodded slightly. "Her name is Emily. She'll be staying with us for a while. We need something to start with." The woman behind the counter raised her eyebrows slightly but said nothing. Instead, she handed Emily the form. "Please fill this out. We can provide you with food, shelter, and legal advice. It's important not only to survive, but to rebuild your life." Emily looked at the form, but her fingers wouldn't move. Her inner resistance was so strong that she couldn't take a step forward. She still didn't believe that this could be for her. "You don't have to fill it out right now," the woman said with a soft smile. "We're here to help you, not to force you to do anything you don't want to do. Just know that no one will judge you here." The words were like a gentle breeze, dispelling her fears. She exhaled, feeling as if for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to stand on guard, ready to strike. But the next moment, her gaze caught on the other woman's husband, sitting in the corner, holding his smartphone, and watching every movement in the room. He clearly had nothing to do with it, but his presence was unbearably clear, an ominous reminder that the world she remained in was still full of betrayal and injustice. "Emily, it's okay," Anthony said, noticing her concern. "We're not alone here, and I'll be there. This is your chance. Don't be afraid of it." She nodded, but she couldn't avoid the thought. What if I'm wrong? What if I do it wrong again now? Her mind was already filled with fragments of old arguments, whispers of people telling her she wasn't worth helping. She'd heard it often. "You don't deserve this." And now when she'd almost agreed, when there was a chance, she didn't yet know if she was ready to accept this new chance. This new world in which she wouldn't be strong, wouldn't be helpless, but just human. "Please fill it out." The woman behind the counter smiled again. Emily picked up the pen. Her hands trembled as she began to write. Each word came with difficulty, as if she were trying to find her place in a world she had once considered alien and hostile. But the more she wrote, the easier it became. At that moment, she felt something inside her begin to unravel. It wasn't a sudden change, but she felt a part of the old, dying part of her disappear. "Thank you," she said, handing over the completed form. The woman behind the counter took it, and their eyes met. There was no pity or sympathy in her gaze, only understanding. And then, as Emily turned to follow Anthony toward the new tenant's room, her steps became more confident. But as soon as they crossed the threshold, her gaze met the same man again, sitting in the corner. His eyes didn't blink. She felt his gaze piercing her. That gaze was familiar. It told her everything she had ever heard from people who didn't understand, who didn't care. "This is not your place. You do not belong here. You do not deserve to be among us." Emily stopped abruptly. The man clenched his teeth and turned away. She saw his fingers tighten around the smartphone. But it wasn't just a look. It was an attack on her right to be here, on her right to be helped. In that moment, before stepping into a new life, she felt that moment when the break with the old faith was the most painful. But she had already taken a step. Emily looked at Anthony. His eyes were calm, full of confidence. He was near. She turned and took the next step. Here in this place, she had a right to be. Emily lay on her bed staring at the ceiling. The room was small but clean, cozy, not a cold refuge like the old car, where you had to cuddle up to the baby to stay warm at night. But that voice was still playing in my head. "This is not your place. You don't belong here. You don't deserve to be among us." The man in the hall, she knew his kind. People who were just waiting to remind her of who she was in their eyes. Nothing. Nearby in a crib, her son was quietly snoring. But there were still voices in her head. Voices from the past, the voice of that man, the voice of her own fears. She sat up abruptly. Time. How much has passed? An hour? 2? She couldn't stay here any longer. Emily glanced quickly at the door. She didn't have a bag. There was nothing to pack anyway. She was used to a life where everything she needed fit into 2 pockets and 1 pair of hands. She stood up. She slowly walked up to the crib and carefully picked up the baby. My chest felt tight. She couldn't do it. I couldn't stay. She walked up to the door and, holding her breath, turned the handle. The door opened silently. The corridor was empty. Step. Second. She had almost reached the exit when she heard a voice. "Are you leaving without saying goodbye?" "Anthony." He stood in the corner, leaning against the wall. There was no condemnation in his gaze, only understanding. Emily froze. "I shouldn't be here. Who said that?" He nodded. "Do you do this often? Tell yourself that you don't deserve something good?" She held the child closer. What if I ruin everything? Anthony looked at her carefully. Have you tried already? Emily didn't answer. Let me ask you another question. He took a step closer. If you leave now, what will change? She swallowed. Nothing. And if you stay? She lowered her head. I don't know, Anthony sighed. Then stay, just to find out. Emily looked at him for a long time, and then she nodded slowly. Fine. Anthony smiled. This is the first time you make a choice, not out of fear, but out of hope. She didn't answer, just took a step back into the room, took a step into the future. Emily sat on her bed staring into space. Her breathing was even, but inside her, a hurricane was raging. She stayed. These two words pounded in my head like a pulsating hum in the silence. The baby slept peacefully in his crib, his tiny fingers occasionally twitching in his sleep. He didn't even know what choice his mother had made that night. He didn't know that this could be the last night he spent in a warm room. Emily clenched her fingers. She has to do something. Something right. She stood up slowly, walked over to the mirror and looked at herself. A sunken face, dark circles under the eyes, tangled hair. She looked alive and dead at the same time. She exhaled. What now? She whispered to herself. She didn't know the answer. The next day, Anthony arrived at the center early in the morning. He knew that if he didn't show up now, she might change her mind. He knew people like her. They are ready to fight, but when the moment of respite comes, they become afraid. Silence is more frightening than pain. When he entered, he was greeted by a female receptionist. She didn't leave, she said, smiling faintly. Anthony nodded. I know. He knocked on the door of her room. Silence. Emily? There was no response. He opened the door carefully. Emily sat in the corner of the bed, looking at him. You're here again? Yes. She nodded as if it mattered. I thought you would disappear. Anthony closed the door behind him. And you wanted me to disappear? Emily shook her head. Don't know. He sat down on the chair opposite her. I brought you something. She smiled weakly. Another hotel room. Anthony shook his head and handed her the folder. Job. She froze. What? I made a deal. They have a vacancy, but you'll have to go through an interview. This isn't a handout. This is an opportunity. She looked at the folder, not daring to pick it up. What job? Administrator at a cafe. Easy job. No overtime. No customers who could humiliate you. They agreed to give you a chance. Emily looked at him as if he had just offered her a ticket to another life. I don't know. You can refuse. She swallowed. I don't want. Anthony smiled. Then take it. She slowly reached out and took the folder. Silence. A long silence filled with 1,000 emotions. Emily looked up at him. I don't know how to thank you. Anthony shook his head. No need, just take this chance. She clutched the folder. I will try. That's all I ask. Emily looked away, then back at him. What if I fail? Anthony smiled. Then I'll help again. Emily hugged the folder tighter to her chest. She knew this day would change everything. She just didn't know how yet. Emily looked at the folder in her hands as if it were a foreign object. Work. Real work. It was like a word from another life, a life she had lost long ago. She had already forgotten what it was like to belong to something. When is the interview? Her voice was quieter than she intended. In 2 hours. She raised her head sharply. What? Anthony shrugged. You have a choice. Either go or say no. But if you say no, I want it to be because you really don't want to, and not because you're afraid. Emily took a deep breath. I'm not ready. Have you ever been prepared for everything that happened to you? She froze. No, she was never prepared for anything that happened to her. For her husband to die. For losing her home. For ending up on the street. She simply took the blows one after another and learned to live with the pain. Anthony stood up. I'm waiting for you downstairs. If you don't come out in 20 minutes, I'll know you've made your choice. He turned and walked out. The door slammed. Emily was left alone. She looked at her son. He was sleeping. She looked at her clothes. Old sweater. Faded jeans. This is not possible. Her fingers closed convulsively around the folder. 20 minutes. Her first chance. Anthony sat in the car looking at his watch. 19 minutes. He didn't know what she would decide, but he knew one thing. If she didn't come out, it wouldn't be because she wasn't capable, because fear won. 20 minutes. He reached for the keys. But at that moment, the door to the center opened. Emily went out. He saw her gaze. There was still fear in her, but now there was something else there. Determination. Anthony smiled. Shall we go? Emily nodded and got into the car. She walked into the cafe feeling like she was going to war. Her hands were shaking, but she clenched them into fists. The man behind the counter, the owner, looked at her over his glasses. Are you Emily? Yes. He nodded. Have you worked in a cafe before? Yes. Can you handle the cash register? Yes. What will you do if a client starts being rude? She tensed. Keep calm, the owner chuckled. What if someone tries to steal something? Emily answered without hesitation. First, I'll assess the situation. If the threat is serious, I'll do everything to avoid conflict. If not, I'll call the police. He nodded. When can you leave? Emily froze. Are you taking me? The owner shrugged. On him. I see that you are one of those who do not give up. There are few such workers. Emily exhaled slowly. I can go out tomorrow. He extended his hand to her. Welcome to the team. She squeezed his hand. At that moment, she realized she's back on her feet. But the battle is not over yet. Emily walked out of the cafe clutching the shift schedule to her chest. The wind caught a strand of her hair, but she didn't even notice. She got the job. She, the man who had just recently been sleeping in a car, considered himself a nobody, was ready to give up. Now she had a chance, a real one. Anthony was waiting for her by the car. Well? Emily slowly looked up at him. I got the job. Anthony smiled. I knew you would get it. She shook her head. You couldn't have known. I could, because I saw in you something that you yourself do not see. Emily swallowed. What exactly? Anthony didn't look away. A person who doesn't give up. She looked at him for a long time, and then she squeezed the graph in her hand. Thank you. For what? She opened her mouth to speak but stopped short. For everything? For not letting her leave? For showing her that she was worth something? For just being there? She was at a loss for words. Anthony nodded as if he understood. Don't say anything. Just move forward. She took a deep breath, and suddenly she asked, Why? He narrowed his eyes. What why? Why did you help me? Why didn't you pass by? Anthony looked at her carefully. Because I could, Emily frowned. That's not an answer. Anthony smiled slightly. Why is it difficult for you to accept it? She was at a loss. Because no one helped me for free. There was always a catch. Anthony nodded. Shakshanam, that's exactly it. People are so used to pain that when someone does good, they look for a hidden meaning in it. But sometimes help doesn't need a motive. Sometimes a person helps simply because he can. Emily froze. These words, just because it can. She slowly clenched her hands into fists. She was always told that there is nothing selfless in the world, that if someone gives you something, it means they want to take twice as much. But now it was different. She looked at Anthony and understood that he did not expect anything in return. She looked at the sheet of paper with the schedule. Tomorrow is her first day at work. She truly begins to live again. Emily took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that I could cope. That night really changed everything.